Alright, y'all. It's been a chaotic week one at the Australian Open, to say the least. Lots to talk about here at the midway point. Obviously, I was unable to get my predictions video off, but I am going to reveal what I had predicted for the tournament, and we will work our way backwards that way, considering a lot of it did not pan out well at all. It's been a very, very unpredictable Australian Open, and a lot of things going off script, so bracket busted to say the least. But we're going to hop right in at the top quarter. Of course, Rafael Nadal was the 1 seed upon Carlos Alcaraz pulling out of the tournament with injury. As you can see, I filled out how far I thought the seeds would go, and I had Nadal and Medvedev facing off in the quarterfinals. Obviously, Rafa coming into this was in a state of extreme vulnerability, of course. Not much traction over the second half of last year, going back to Wimbledon, and, all kinds of physical problems in that span as well. I was kind of expecting him to wipe the slate clean here. I've spoken quite a bit where it was hard to really be all that concerned at this point with Nadal, considering a lot of those were on his worst surface, not much rhythm in his play, not having played that much, etc., etc. It did feel like, for the confidence, he needed a big Australian Open, at least make it to the quarterfinals, and while he did have a very difficult draw, I would say, in spite of picking up that hip injury in the second round, I would say that Nadal remained stuck in the mud here in Australia. Draper, obviously, a very tough first round draw, but while Nadal did win ugly and could take some solace in having gotten through that match, it wasn't the most encouraging at the same time. I did think there were decent patches of play in the first and fourth set before Draper eventually gave up physically midway through the fourth. But in between those sets, there was also just extremely mediocre play. And then you followed it up against Mackie McDonald, an opponent that you would think Nadal matched up pretty well. I expected straight sets out of that one, but again, from the get-go, even before he got hurt, he was not playing great at all. Credit to Mackie for redlining as he did, throughout the course of that match. I don't think I've ever seen him play at a level that high, and he did it for most of that match. But that being said, really scratchy from the other side of the net, even before that hip flexor injury was picked up. Once that happened, it became pretty evident that Nadal had no chance in this match. For me, was really a Australian Open 2014 final-like viewing experience, with Nadal wanting to keep going, finish the match, but, never really having a shot. The guy really just couldn't run beyond a jog after 2-4 in the second, and now you have the same injury, just to a worse degree, with a grade 2 injury that he had with the hip in the Australian Open in 2018. And like 2018, I think the best course of action for him would be to wait until clay court season before making his return. But bottom line, it does feel like we come away from this Aussie Open with the same concerns, perhaps amplified, as we had for Nadal going in. While to this point I wasn't really worrying about him, I did always maintain that, for the people that felt like the body was breaking down and that this might be the beginning of decline, I said I could entertain the possibility of that. I mean, it's 36 years old. Last couple seasons have been injury-riddled, and expecting that physical front to just fix itself as he gets older is not realistic. We'll see what he's got whenever he ends up returning, but, it is pretty evident that he is going to have to rebuild the confidence, and, becomes even more imperative that he schedule smart moving forward. Beyond that, in this quarter, we've seen Khachanov make it to the quarterfinals, and in doing so, Karen now has made quarters at all 4 majors, making him, I believe, only the 9th active player right now, alongside the big 4, Stan Wawrinka, Marin Cilic, Matteo Berrettini, Jannik Sinner, and now Karen Khachanov, and quietly putting together a nice little run in the last couple hardcourt majors, semifinals at the US Open, of course, now quarters in Australia, getting a really, really nice win over both Francis Tiafoe and then Yoshihito Nishioka. I was expecting Francis to beat Khachanov here in the third round. And I did catch the first 2 sets of that match, and I didn't even feel Tiafoe was really playing all that poorly. Khachanov was just so solid and really just flexing his firepower from the back of the court in that match early on. Just so solid. Really was forcing Francis to dig deep in his bag of tricks as far as pulling out the drop shots, getting to net. Just trying to do everything that he could do to mix it up and make Khachanov uncomfortable, but Khachanov just seemed watertight. Obviously, Francis almost forced the 5th set in the 4th with the 6-1 lead in the breaker. Didn't catch that, but, that's an insane comeback because usually 6-1, that kind of lead in a tiebreak seems like a foregone conclusion. And then backing that win up with really a rout of Nishioka, save the 3rd set. I really expected a tighter match there, but seemed like Yoshi a little bit was overcome by the moment early in that match. Didn't have the experience of being this far in a slam, I believed, at this point, and Karen just chugs on. And having made all 4 quarterfinals at all the slams feels like a really cool achievement, and it is really hard to evaluate Karen because he's been pretty consistent against guys that you think he should beat. I mean, he feels like a lock for, anyone he plays outside the top 50, and there's not many players that you can really have that trust in. But at the same time, he has not been nearly the threat that you would have envisioned after that famous Bercy run in 2018, where he beat Djokovic, Zverev, etc., to win that title. And up until that point, he was a guy that really could push the top guys, but these days it seems like he's become more of a litmus test. I mean, he beats who he needs to beat, and then against the top flight opponents, really has not been a threat for a really long time. And beyond that, he has not won an ATP title of any level ever since that Bercy win in 2018. But you've got to give him credit, in a tour right now where consistency is becoming fewer and far between, he seems to be flourishing amid this chaos. Moving down the line, Hubi Hurkacz, I would say good effort to make it to the second week here. He had not made it beyond the second round of either of the hardcourt slams. A pretty perplexing stat. But in general, I have found Hubi to be a very tough player to get a read on. I thought his 3rd round against Shapovalov was a match that was as unpredictable as they come as far as declaring a winner. Shapo had past success at this tournament, so I tentatively went with him. Super weird 5-setter between him and Hubi, as I think you would expect. But, Dennis found himself 2 sets down, having broken the Hurkacz serve, I believe, 5 times in the first 2 sets. Yeah, the math really just does not compute in that situation. But, that's just how the cookie has crumbled throughout Shapo's career with the way that he plays, the decision-making, and just how reckless it is at times. And then we get to the really interesting part here in Sebastian Korda. I had watched that Adelaide final with Korda Djokovic in its entirety, and I've got to say, I was very, very impressed with Sebi in his showing in that match. I used to be very, very high on Korda back in 2021. Last year seemed like a bit of stagnation, if not regression. I just felt like there wasn't enough progression there, albeit he was still very young, but, the issues with the serve still were concerning, and the fitness issues as far as durability were still rearing their ugly heads. But, the player I saw in Adelaide, completely different dude. Serve was extremely effective, especially that second serve kick against the greatest returner of all time in that Adelaide final, and the closing issues still are there with Korda. I think that's been something that's pretty blatant to see and has been ever since he broke onto the scene. But, the good thing that I've seen that's been a consistent trend has been that, albeit the nerves are most certainly there, he has some pretty stunning, really, collapses. Like that first set against Novak made it so much harder than it needed to be, 5-4, 40 love, and played just a bunch of tight points in succession to give up that game. Similar kind of thing when he played Daniil Medvedev here in Australia in the 3rd round. Got out to early leads in just about every set, I believe, and let Medvedev back in. And then even his 4th round against Hubi He really was dominating the final set tiebreak. And again, it came down to the wire because he got really, really tight as he saw the finish line. But you can definitely take out encouragement in the trend among all of these matches is that he really has not been deterred. He's still gone for his shots. Unlike, that match against Rafa at Indian Wells where he really seemed to freeze up after blowing that initial lead. In all these matches, whether it took 7 set points against Djokovic, blowing a double break and break lead to Medvedev in just about every single set, he reset really nicely in all those situations. It wasn't something that scarred him for the long haul amid those matches. And beyond that, you really are seeing some very Baby Berdych-esque tennis out of Korda. That backhand seriously is one of the best in the game. It's absolute class and can go toe-to-toe with just about anybody. And without a doubt, he has been very, very impressive out of the gates in 2023. And in the early going, Korda looks like he is looking to be a bona fide top 20 player by the end of the year, may even be competing for a top 10 spot. Now let's get to Daniil Medvedev on the flip side of this. I anticipated Medvedev going to the semifinals, and through even his first match of the tournament, I felt like he was going to be very difficult to beat here. These conditions seemed like they were ideal for him, quick court, balls that a lot of players had complained about, but were heavy enough to make it seem like theoretically Medvedev would be even more impenetrable. And with a Nadal that was vulnerable as the highest seed in his quarter, I think most people felt like he was the favorite to win the quarter, and given his hard court pedigree, the favorite to make it to the final in this half. And everything seemed like it was going right on schedule after those first 2 matches where he looked awesome. But with this stretch going back to North American swing last year, a stretch that's usually his favorite part of the year, and including indoor swing and Australia, and I think that it's safe to say that amid this stretch that's usually his best of the year, it's safe to say that for now, Daniil Medvedev's aura, that hardcourt pedigree I referenced, it's been busted. That's a benefit of the doubt that he had undoubtedly earned with his performance over the last couple of years, going back to that summer of 2019. And I still was kind of hanging on to that, the player that he had been, and trusted that eventually it would fix itself up over these last couple months. In fact, before the event, my prediction was Medvedev to win the World Tour Finals. Then in Adelaide, after he looked good on his way to the semis, I thought that he would beat Novak Djokovic in the semis, at the very least push him 3. And after being proven so wrong on both those counts at the end of the year and beginning of the year, and Medvedev still struggling throughout his favorite parts of the year, it did make me a bit wary. Now, I did still pick him to go to the final. I thought he was the favorite in the half, not by much, but again, theoretically, it made a lot of sense, I think, to still give him the benefit of the doubt. But I say wary in the sense that even after dismantling his first 2 opponents and looking so good, I still had some cause to pause because we've seen a trend in the last couple months with Medvedev, even in conditions favorable to him. And that is that he has long been starved for a win against a contender or top dog. I assumed Korda would be a test, considering how big a step up he was from Medvedev's first 2 opponents. They really didn't force him out of his comfort zone at all. That, combined with the great form that Sebi was in, I expected Daniil to have his hands full. But I definitely did not expect that, because for the most part, Korda was in complete control of that match. And yeah, it really is some soul-searching time for Daniil Medvedev, because we just went through the entire stretch where he excels from North American hardcourt swing through the Australian summer, and he just has not looked the same. And I've said for a while that I don't think last year's Australian Open final, as devastating a loss as it was for him, was the sole purpose for his down year in 2022. But with this keeping up as long as it has after, that's definitely going to be seen as the inflection point. It's pretty jarring. I mean, Medvedev has not beaten a top 10 player since the semifinals of that tournament. Ever since losing that final, I believe he's now 0-8 against the top 10. And with much of the tour seemingly having the game plan for success against him now, it does feel a little bit like we're back to square one and that he's going to have to scale the mountain again from the bottom up. So obviously goes without saying, that was a very eventful quarter. Moving on to the Tsitsipas quarter. Quite a few upsets still brewing here and throughout the rest of the draw, but nothing I think as crazy as the top quarter. So of course you start with Tsitsipas, and for Stef, he has been in immaculate form throughout the course of this year so far, between ATP Cup and now the Australian Open as well. And I think you could tell that Tsitsipas was poised to start 2023 much better than 2022, especially with how he ended 22. I mean, not that it was a particularly scorching end to the season, but, a couple of key matches where he gave good showings in big spots, particularly those two against Novak in Paris and then the Tour Finals. Most of the second half of last year, really, in general, it felt like Steph was beginning to find his form again, and he has definitely raised it to begin 2023. Through to the quarterfinals yet again, it has been his most consistent major. Going back to 2019, I believe he's made semis 3 out of 4 times. And you'd have to say thus far a very tidy route to the quarterfinals, swept aside those that really weren't a threat to him, didn't drop a set, en route to the round of 16. Of course, Sinner versus Tsitsipas was the marquee round of 16 match. Sinner traditionally has been a pretty good matchup for Steph, but you did feel that this one would definitely be closer than last year's contest was in the quarterfinals between these two. And really a very nip and tuck match between these two in spite of no real extended sets in the match. They ended up only being separated by 3 points, I believe, in total points won. And obviously you had Tsitsipas fending off bucket loads of break points in that match. In all, I believe Sinner was 4 of 26 on breakpoint, although, it's not a case of, Jannik missed a lot of chances here. He did usually break in the games where he brought up a breakpoint, and that really is what counts. Just took him a lot of bites at the apple in this particular match. But yeah, given Sinner's rapid improvement over the second half of last year, Coach Cahill now in his box, expected all of that to play into Jannik putting in a much better showing for himself than he did in this matchup a year ago, and he most certainly did that. Gotta commend Tsitsipas for coming through, all tournament long. His forehand, his serve have been firing away. You'd have to say he's definitely the favorite to make it out of the final in this top half. He's looked great, and now he's passed a pretty stern test in the form of Jannik Sinner. On the flip side, I was really impressed with what Sinner did through his 4 matches in this tournament. What stuck out to me was it felt like he was a bit more comfortable at net and had worked on those volleys over the offseason. It's now cemented pretty much that Sinner does have the ceiling right now to compete with the top dogs. Honestly, given his age, I think he still has some time to improve that ceiling even more. Has to be disappointing for him, these last couple majors, last 3 majors now, that his campaigns have ended in tough 5th set losses. But for Sinner, I still think it's early enough in the career where he still has time, where you can still take solace in these types of losses. And, it's really just impressive that he has established himself in so little time. You'd have to say solidly as a contender where, he's really competitive in these slams, really consistent. He's only losing to the best of the best. Only losing by the smallest of margins. Elsewhere, tough early draws for Botic van de Zandschulp and Lorenzo Musetti. Cam Norrie, I do want to say I've noted how much he's improved over the last couple of years. I did have him going to the quarterfinals because he had looked so good out of the gates in 2023. But between bowing out in the 3rd round to Lehecka at the Australian Open and losing that Auckland final to Richard Gasquet, you do have to say that for that great start, there's not much to show for it. And save what was a landmark run to the semifinals of Wimbledon last year, it still feels to me like Cam Norrie hasn't totally shed that slam underperformer label. And then you got one of the stories of this year's tournament, Yuri Lehecka, got through Borna in the first round, and for Borna, I don't know what in the world is going on there, because that Cincinnati run just looking more and more like a blip in the radar by the day, considering he has not anywhere near replicated that form since. But in retrospect, considering what Lehecka has done at this tournament, not the biggest shock, at least in hindsight. Beat Coric, beat Cam Norrie 3rd round, and then 4th round followed it up by upsetting Felix Auger-Aliassime. Honestly, I have not seen much of Lehecka aside from that one semifinal run of Rotterdam a year ago where he made some noise, but he does seem like a fantastic young player. Looks like he's in the midst of one of those young player putting the pieces together tournament runs. Honestly, haven't watched much of him this tournament, even beyond highlights, but that FAA match in the 4th round, I caught most of it, and from the looks of it, really, after the first set, he really looked like he had Felix overmatched once FAA's serve was back into play. Really, that was the only thing keeping this one close in the latter stretches, because after the first set, Lehecka was easily the player that was getting the better of action, setting up more chances, and honestly, I think that the last couple of sets could have been more lopsided than the breaker outcome that we actually got. So Lehecka does seem like a player that has quite a bit of talent. I wouldn't be surprised if he knocked a set off against Tsitsipas in the quarters, and he has started his 2023 off with quite a bang. On the other hand, for Felix, his loss completed the Netflix curse, with every single one of the players headlined in the first 5 episodes of that Netflix series going out in the early rounds of this tournament, ironically enough. And, it is a bit of a trend now that Felix has been a slow starter in majors. Even the deep runs that he has made now over the last year and a half, he has had some very close calls in the opening rounds. And this tournament, again, was no different. Had to rally from, to begin with, a set down against, way past his best Vasek Pospisil, and then 2 sets down from Alex Molcan in the second round. That I do find, a bit of a concerning trend, but Felix is young, in great condition, so he can shrug that off for now. What I felt was more alarming was the way that he looked against Lehecka, and at times against Molcan, was just how serve-dependent he seemed. To me, there seems to be a bit too much variation in the level at which his ground strokes can be on a given day. The serve always has been his most consistent, reliant weapon, and we know all the other, athletic traits and gifts that he possesses, and those do allow you to think about what the total package could be when it all clicks. But clearly, in spite of the step forward last year, we still are not to the point where Felix is going to be taking a leap. But at the end of the day, also, all you can do is congratulate Jiří Lehecka. He played great and honestly outclassed Felix, and it's been a very impressive run to his maiden quarterfinal. Moving on to the Novak Djokovic quarter, this one, the fireworks already began before the tournament started, with Nick Kyrgios having to withdraw from the event. As he expressed, obviously, a tremendous blow. We all know how much Nick loves to play at home. That too probably being in the most confident frame of mind with his game that he ever has been heading into Australia. He probably would have liked his chances to set up a rematch of the Wimbledon final in the quarters against Novak. Prior to his withdrawal, of course, I had him out in the 3rd round. To me, I just felt like it would be a bit too soon to have a challenge like Rune, considering how sparsely Nick has played since the US Open. Basically nothing at all, aside from doubles at the Tour Finals and, the little singles action in Tokyo. He aggravated his knee there again. Of course, playing sparsely is nothing new for Nick Kyrgios and how he schedules, but I still had Holger taking that in the 3rd round, but, now with the news being what it is, all you can do on that front really is wish Kyrgios the best in recovery. Hope he can return to the court soon enough. And then with that being the case for Andrei Rublev, a man who again enjoyed another top 8 finish last year, and is usually a pretty safe bet to beat who he should. You expected him to be in that 4th round, and he was, and did it really, really convincingly, including sweeping aside Dan Evans, who can put up some resistance on his day. I have been recording this video over the course of 2 days, so after last night, I do know the result of the Andrei Rublev-Holger Rune match. That was another blockbuster round of 16, one that was heavily anticipated. Holger, of course, coming off a red-hot end of 2022. He was looking really convincing in this tournament as well, brushed aside everyone he faced in straight sets. Holger did have a bit of an injury scare in his round 3 against Humbert, I believe with his ankle and his wrist. Still, I did expect him to beat Andrei Rublev. With or without Kyrgios, I was expecting Rune to meet Djokovic in the quarterfinals. Obviously, at the stage of the career that Holger's at right now, he's not a lock against a guy like Rublev, but, the bottom line was I just figured that Holger at his best is going to do everything just better than Andrei. And while I wasn't completely focused on this match while watching it, it did seem like quite the sloppy contest. Throughout the match, really until the 5th set, Andrei seemed like he had the better of the action. Holger really needed to claw and fight hard to get out of that 4th set. And while he is still young, he will rue the chances he missed in this 5th set against Rublev. Rune got the early break, extended that lead to 5-2 in the 5th. And then for the better part of the next 3 games, Holger just struggled to find the court. Maybe a combination of tensing up, maybe, not being 100%, which he didn't seem he was, seemed to struggle with the conditions a bit, and, maybe just not completely recovered from his ailments from the prior match. But all that considered, considering the volume of chances he had down the stretch here, I'm sure he's not going to be giving himself any excuses. We got to a final set tiebreak. Rune extended an early 5-0 lead in that breaker. That went from 5-0 to 5-2 to 7-3 to out of nowhere 9-7 Rublev. I can say with confidence this was not a great match, but, fantastic drama down the stretch. It still had a little bit of a twist left in the tail. Rune came up with as spectacular a match point save as you will see, down 9-8. And then, of course, at the end of another epic, much like Murray Berrettini, this one saw Rublev get a dead net court winner on match point. All I can say is that's a phenomenal win for Andrei Rublev, a match that most probably weren't picking him to win. And, that'll probably make it even sweeter because we've seen him in situations where he was the favorite so many times and he's come up on the short end of the stick of these heartbreakers to lose. And for a change, he comes out on top, pulls an absolute Houdini in the 5th. Elsewhere in this quarter, PCB, I feel like I've seen that movie before. It does feel like just about every year PCB has had one of these just gut punch down to the wire losses. Losing a 2-set to love lead sounds very familiar for him for the last couple of years. I can remember one to Zverev, I can remember one to Cressy, and, now another one to Benjamin Bonzi. For Grigor Dimitrov and Alex de Minaur, unfortunately, they were drawn with the fate of facing Novak Djokovic before the quarterfinals. All these guys really can be lumped together. Novak Djokovic in his return to Australia has very much looked like the 9-time champion here. The guy is just in his element out here in Australia, and he has not skipped a beat in his return. Pre-tournament, he was just about everybody's favorite to hoist the title here, and while that hamstring injury that carried over from Adelaide has been a factor, I don't think I've seen anything that would derail the title outlook in the slightest. The injury has been prevalent, of course, particularly in his second and third matches. That was apparent. There were points in times of those matches where he just seemed like he could not extend completely and stretch for those open stance shots that he's so famous for on defense. He just sometimes was not chasing down balls that you would expect him to. But I would say this has been for stretches in matches. In the most recent match he played against de Minaur, he looked as good as he had the entire tournament. Shades of his 2019 Australian Open final performance, honestly. It was absolutely one-way traffic, and he really just made Demon look like he was weaponless out there. Beyond that, just the last time Djokovic played this tournament, he showed that he's up there with the best of them in managing an impairment like this where it won't completely wreck his ability to play at a high level. If there was somebody to really put that movement to the test and have Djokovic in an uncomfortable position, it looked like it would be Dimitrov in the third round, and I do think that Grigor could have put in a better showing to put that movement to the test. But in those high leverage moments, he just did not show enough killer instinct and did not put in enough balls. To my eye, Dimitrov in the match just way too errant and not really reading what was going on the other side of the net. Djokovic, on the other hand, knew exactly what to do. You know, it's been a true and tried method of just breaking down the Dimitrov backhand, and he certainly was committed to doing so, and he did exactly that. And in those tense moments, particularly in the first set, he found the first serve, as he always does when his back is to the wall. And once he got through that, I really was not expecting much from the de Minaur match, but, you know, the way he played in that match, the numbers don't do it justice. It was honestly shades of some of his vintage performances there, and, you know, that performance really has put aside any doubts I had, and they were minimal to begin with, and it feels like it's inevitable to me, spoiler alert, that I think Novak Djokovic is just destined for number 22 here. Unlike Aussie Open 2021, the draw forward is pretty routine, and yet again, Melbourne is looking very much like Novak Djokovic's backyard. And so finally, we move on to the bottom quarter, where yet again you saw a flurry of top seeds exiting early. In this quarter, I had Taylor Fritz to the semi for the second straight slam, and for the second straight slam, he exited early, this time in the second round at the hands of Alexei Popyrin. This time, I don't really fault Fritz as much as I did at the US Open for going out early. Obviously, Popyrin had a horrendous 2022, probably his worst year ever on tour. But I did catch most of this match, and it really is hard to blame Fritz when A, he picked up an ankle injury midway through the match, and B, for the most part, Popyrin just was zoning. If you've ever seen Alexei play, obviously you know he's a big guy, has the big serve, and just tees off on just about every ground stroke he gets a look at. He definitely seemed to feed off that Aussie crowd, really threw all their support behind him, and he really played one of the matches of his life. Tough for Fritz to go out again, especially as he seems to be in the midst of the prime of his career. But in spite of having lost our number one player early, Americans really are flourishing at this year's Australian Open, as we have 3 of them through to the quarterfinals, and at least one of them is going to be through to the semifinals. And in general, a lot of Americans making headlines at this year's Australian Open, most recently and perhaps most notably Ben Shelton last night, edging out fellow Cincinnati native and fellow former Ohio State Buckeye, J.J. Wolf. Took 5 sets, but, you know, on Ben Shelton, the reigning NCAA singles champ, I did watch him live against Casper Ruud in Cincinnati last year. I distinctly remember coming away from that match thinking the kid has some explosive power. Really blew Ruud off the court that day. And I've hardly watched him since then, but at this Australian Open, I am really beginning to wonder if he can be something special for American tennis. Potentially bring in some oomph and star power to the men's American tennis scene again. He's a big guy, explosive power was the first thing I noticed, but he's super well-rounded, it seems like. You know, he has an absolute rocket of a serve. The mental fortitude seems to be there, and, you know, from the looks of it, seems to be pretty charismatic. As an American, you've got to love to see it. For the other seeds, as you can see, you know, I didn't have high hopes for Khachanov or Diego Schwartzman. Diego seems like his best days are behind him, and to make matters worse, he suffered an injury in his Aussie Open tune-up. As for Alexander Zverev, I was not expecting a deep run straight off the bat. If you watch my video on what to keep an eye out for in the 2023 season, I'm sure many of you would have noticed I left Zverev out of my predicted top 10 for the end of the year. And the rationale for that pretty much is my rationale for why I wasn't picking him to go deep this early in his comeback. Coming off an injury with as much trauma as that, I think you just have to default to accepting that it's going to be a long road back. If that doesn't end up being the case and Sasha Zverev is back to being his old self in short order, then that is a miraculously great effort by him, but placing the expectations that we had for him pre-injury on him straight off the bat, that just seems completely unrealistic, and so I think it's just of the utmost importance that you frame those expectations in the context of just how brutal an injury he suffered. Now, on the flip side for Matteo Berrettini, who I did place top 10 expectations on, all I really can say is that he was given the misfortune of drawing a Renaissance Andy Murray, and all three of Andy's matches at this year's tournament were just an absolutely heroic effort, one of the best stories of this tournament. All three of his matches I was watching and asking myself, how in the world is Andy Murray pulling this off? In his medal hip era, he's done it before where he challenges, the very top of the game. He did it with Tsitsipas first round of the US Open in 2021, but it's always been about that next matchup and how he's going to recover, and historically, ever since hip surgery, Murray has not been able to back it up. Understandably so, of course, but this Australian Open absolutely cemented Andy Murray's declaration that he felt stronger and better endurance-wise coming into this season. It was one thing to pull out that win against Berrettini in almost 5 hours, where it looked like Murray was headed towards another heartbreaking loss after Berrettini really locked in for the last 3 sets. But it was another thing entirely to follow that up by winning the longest match in Murray's storied career. And then he followed that up looking absolutely dead on his feet throughout the match against RBA, several times almost going down 6-1, 5-2 double break, just to end up stealing the set in hilariously epic fashion from a guy that looked like he had cinder blocks as legs. And even after that, it really took the best of Roberto Bautista Agut to finish him off. Just so many great signs from Andy Murray this Australian Open. Tennis-wise, that's the best he's hit his forehand since before hip surgery, and absolutely the most aggressive-minded he's been willing to be since that time as well. You hope those tendencies weren't just coaxed out of how fatigued he was, because he showed he's capable of executing that effectively, but even if it wasn't, Murray certainly over-delivered on declaring that he's capable of going the long haul again, and even beyond that, this will be one of the most legacy-defining moments of Andy Murray's career, and it's absolutely bonkers that he's still able to deliver a week like he did at this year's Australian Open. Also, shout out to Tommy Paul, who's made his way to the quarterfinals as well, and, I think a little bit under the radar, Tommy Paul improved a lot at the end of last year. Second half of last season got some big wins. Alcaraz in Canada took Casper Ruud 5 at the US Open, and then of course beating Rafa in Bercy. Tommy Paul, always a really fun watch and a really talented guy. He's been on tour longer than you would think, but it is really nice to see that he's beginning to figure it out. Some really nice wins this tournament as well, being able to take out ADF as well as RBA following his huge win over Andy Murray. Also took out Jenson Brooksby, who upset Casper Ruud, the number 2 seed, of course. That's a pretty good segue into the last big name of this quarter. I had Ruud, despite being the highest ranked in this quarter, losing to Berrettini in the round of 16. Never seemed like it was meant to be to go deep in this tournament for Casper. Obviously well documented how he has played a lot of tennis, particularly to end last year. Obviously had a pretty grueling run to the finals in Turin, and then followed it up and played that exhibition tour throughout South America with Rafa. You could kind of see a little bit of burnout oncoming for Ruud. I mean, he lost to Laszlo Gera in Auckland, and he even was speaking that he was planning on taking a big break after the Australian Open. He himself expressed that he felt like this much tennis was just not good for the body. And Jensen Brooksby played a very sound tactical match, really locked Ruud in backhand jail in that match, but Ruud really never looked like he was going to be able to kick it into his highest gear this tournament. Just felt like he was right there for the taking. So that brings us to these quarterfinals. I'm sure given my comments earlier in this video, you can probably fill in the blanks for where I'm going for this tournament as a whole. Djokovic versus the field to me has rarely ever looked like as easy a call as it is right now. Tsitsipas obviously looking like he's in great form, but Novak has owned him. I'm expecting that to be the final, as I'm sure is the case for most right now. But for quarterfinals, I will go Korda over Khachanov in 4. Those two have had some insane matches, the most notably off the top of my head being that Wimbledon match, I believe in 2021, which was real wacky, just breaks all around. I'll take the flip side this time. I say Korda gets it done in 4. If it goes 5 again, I do favor Karen because, say what you want about the guy, but physical fitness has never been an issue for him. He's a beast in that standpoint. But I'll say Korda in the form that he's in doesn't let it get to that. Korda in 4. Tsitsipas Lehecka seems to be two guys in really good form. Tsitsipas was the one that ended that most notable result prior to this one of Lehecka's at Rotterdam last year. That was a competitive match then, and I do expect Lehecka to be able to take a set here. But Stef, obviously the more experienced player in these stages, and to this point is still in a different weight class. Pressure will be on him to make it to the final now. But in the quarters, I like Tsitsipas to go through in 4 as well. For Djokovic Rublev, it's easy to forget that Andre has beaten Novak once, but obviously a very different time. Novak early in his comeback last summer in Belgrade, and as they will be facing off on a hard court again, no less Djokovic's favorite hard court in his career, I expect the results to mimic that of their prior hard court meetings to this point. From a purely matchup standpoint, Andre seems to be someone that plays right into Novak's hands. Don't think it will be to the extent that Demon did, but still, Novak coming off easily his best display of the tournament, and a really ominous one for the rest of the field. I like Djokovic to roll in 3. And lastly, we got the kid, Ben Shelton against Tommy Paul. This is one that I think could go either way. Shelton to this point has played with quite a bit of freedom, but he's also had to go 5 twice. The toll on the body so far in Melbourne, combined with potentially some nerves being in this big a spot for the first time, I'll give the edge to Tommy Paul and say he wins in 5. But yeah, yeesh, that was a lot of catch-up we had to play on the Australian Open so far. Hopefully I can avoid this type of situation, try to be more consistent throughout the second week of this tournament. If you made it this far, really long video, thank you for sticking around. If you enjoyed the video, it would be much appreciated if you could drop a like, help the video perform better in YouTube's algorithm, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Thank you all again so much for watching, and of course I will see y'all in the next one.